September 12, 1943. Rue Saint-Jacques, Paris. The smell of ersatz coffee and burnt chicory drifted through Marie Dubois's second-floor apartment as she stood at her window watching German soldiers march past in perfect formation, their boots striking cobblestones with mechanical precision that had become the rhythm of occupied Paris for 3 years. She was 34 years old, a schoolteacher before the occupation, now a clerk at the local ration office, a position that allowed her to survive in a city where survival had become an art form requiring constant calculation. Her husband had died at Dunkirk in May 1940. No children. No close family remaining in the city. She lived alone in 3 small rooms that smelled perpetually of damp plaster and the neighbor's boiled cabbage. The apartment building at 47 Rue Saint-Jacques housed 12 families. Everyone knew everyone's business or pretended not to know. Madame Chevalier on the ground floor collaborated openly, entertaining German officers twice a week. Monsieur Laurent on the 3rd floor listened to BBC broadcasts at night with his ear pressed against an illegal radio receiver. The Goldstein family had disappeared from the 4th floor in July 1942. Their apartment remained empty, the door sealed with official notices no one dared remove. Marie had learned the rules of survival in occupied Paris through 3 years of careful observation and deliberate invisibility. Never draw attention. Never volunteer information. Never take unnecessary risks. Keep your head down, your mouth shut, your opinions hidden. Collaborate just enough to avoid suspicion but not enough to become complicit. Walk the narrow line between resistance and collaboration, between courage and cowardice, between survival and surrender. She had mastered this balance until the morning everything changed. That morning began like every other morning for 1,127 consecutive days. She woke at 6:30 to the sound of German trucks rumbling down Boulevard Saint-Michel. She washed her face in cold water from the basin. No hot water for 3 months. No coal for the heating. She dressed in the same gray wool skirt and white blouse she wore 4 days a week, the fabric thin from repeated washing, the collar frayed but carefully mended to remain presentable. The ration office opened at 8. Marie arrived at 7:45 as she always did, to find Madame Laurent already sorting through the day's paperwork. The office occupied the ground floor of a converted bakery. The smell of bread was long gone, replaced by the odor of bureaucratic ink and dusty files. The work was tedious and essential. Every Parisian needed ration cards to obtain food, clothing, fuel. The cards were power. The cards were survival. The cards were leverage. German authorities controlled the system through French administrators who did the actual work. Marie processed applications, verified identities, stamped official documents with rubber stamps that represented the difference between eating and starving. She had developed a reputation for efficiency and discretion. The Germans trusted her. The French trusted her. Neither knew what she actually thought because she never spoke unnecessarily. At 11:30 that morning, a young woman entered the ration office carrying forged identity papers so obvious that Marie recognized the forgery within seconds. The photograph had been poorly cut and pasted. The official stamps were slightly misaligned. The signature was in the wrong color ink. But the young woman looked desperate and exhausted, and something in her expression made Marie hesitate before raising the alarm. The young woman's name, according to the papers, was Simone Mercier from Lyon. She needed ration cards for her elderly aunt who had recently moved to Paris. The story was plausible. The papers were not. Marie glanced at Madame Laurent who was occupied with another client. She looked at the clock. 15 minutes until the German supervisor made his daily rounds. She could report the forgery. That was her job. That was safe. Or she could approve the application and hope no one noticed. That was dangerous. That was complicit. That was a choice. She stamped the papers with quick, practiced movements, her expression neutral, her hands steady. The young woman thanked her quietly and left. The entire transaction took 90 seconds. Marie did not know who the young woman really was. She did not know where the ration cards would go. She did not ask questions. But she had crossed a line she had carefully avoided crossing for 3 years. She had made a choice that could not be unmade. She had risked safety for something she could not quite name, perhaps decency, perhaps defiance, perhaps simply the refusal to participate in one more small cruelty. That night she could not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed listening to footsteps in the hallway, waiting for the knock that would mean discovery and arrest. The knock did not come. The next day was ordinary. The day after was ordinary. A week passed. 2 weeks. A month. Nothing happened. Then, on October 19, 1943, the young woman returned to the ration office with a different request, this time delivered in a whisper while pretending to discuss paperwork. "We need your help. There is a British pilot. He is hiding in the city. He needs papers. He needs food. He needs a safe house. We have been watching you. We know you can be trusted." Marie felt her stomach drop. She had imagined this moment during the sleepless nights following her small act of rebellion. She had prepared her refusal. Too dangerous. Too risky. Not my fight. I'm just trying to survive. Leave me alone. But when the moment came, When the young woman looked at her with eyes that carried the weight of desperate hope, Marie heard herself say something she had not planned to say. How long would he need to stay? The British pilot's name was Flight Lieutenant James Fletcher, 23 years old. Shot down over northern France on October 9 while returning from a bombing raid on German industrial targets in the Ruhr Valley. His Lancaster bomber had taken flak at 18,000 feet. 3 engines failed. The pilot ordered the crew to bail out over the French countryside. Fletcher was the navigator. He parachuted into a wheat field 12 miles southeast of Amiens at 2:14 in complete darkness. His parachute was spotted by a farmer who belonged to a local resistance network. The farmer hid Fletcher in a barn for 3 days while the network made arrangements. Fletcher spoke no French. The farmer spoke no English. They communicated through gestures and drawings. On the third night, resistance members moved Fletcher to a safe house in Amiens. From there he was supposed to travel south toward the Pyrenees and cross into Spain, the standard escape route for Allied airmen. But the Gestapo had infiltrated the network. 2 guides were arrested. The safe houses were compromised. The escape route collapsed. Fletcher became trapped in Amiens with no way forward, and German search teams combing the city for a British airman reported missing after the air raid. The resistance made a decision. Move him to Paris. Hide him in the city where one more face would disappear into millions. On October 18, Fletcher traveled to Paris in the back of a coal delivery truck, covered by sacks that left him coated in black dust. He arrived at a warehouse in the 11th arrondissement where resistance members provided him with civilian clothes, forged papers identifying him as Jean-Pierre Fontaine, a deaf-mute factory worker from Normandy, and instructions to speak to no one under any circumstances. Marie Dubois received these instructions on October 20 during a meeting in the back room of a pharmacy on Rue Mouffetard. 3 resistance members were present. None gave their real names. They explained the situation with clinical efficiency. Fletcher needed a place to hide for approximately 3 weeks while new escape arrangements were made. Her apartment was suitable because she lived alone, because she worked regular hours that would provide cover for his presence, because her building had multiple exits and a cellar accessible from the courtyard. They did not ask if she was willing. They assumed her earlier cooperation meant she had already made that decision. They were correct, though Marie herself did not fully understand why she had made it. Perhaps it was the accumulated weight of 3 years of small compromises and moral capitulations that made one act of genuine resistance feel necessary. Perhaps it was the memory of her husband who had died fighting the same enemy that now occupied her city. Perhaps it was simply that when confronted with a choice between safety and decency, she discovered she was the kind of person who chose decency. Fletcher arrived at her apartment at 9:30 on the evening of October 21. He knocked 3 times, paused, knocked twice. The prearranged signal. Marie opened the door to find a young man in poorly fitting civilian clothes carrying a small canvas bag. He was tall and thin with dark hair and blue eyes that held the exhausted wariness of someone who had been hunted for 12 days. He stepped inside quickly. She closed the door and locked it. They stood in the narrow hallway looking at each other without speaking. Marie saw a frightened boy trying to appear brave. Fletcher saw a middle-aged woman whose expression revealed nothing. The silence stretched. Finally, Marie spoke in careful English learned during her years as a schoolteacher. You will sleep in the spare room. You will not go near the windows during the day. You will not make noise. You will not use the toilet when the neighbors might hear. If someone knocks, you will hide in the cellar. Do you understand? Fletcher nodded. Yes, madam. Thank you, madam. I understand the risk you are taking. Marie showed him the spare room. It was barely larger than a closet. A narrow bed, a small table, no window. The room had been her husband's study before the war. Now it held boxes of old books and winter clothes she could not bring herself to discard. She cleared space for Fletcher's bag. This is where you will stay. I work from 8 until 5. You will remain in this room while I am gone. I will bring food morning and evening. Fletcher thanked her again. His French was terrible, but he tried. She appreciated the effort. That first night, neither of them slept much. Marie lay in her bed listening to every sound in the apartment, imagining boots on the stairs, fists pounding on the door. Fletcher lay in the spare room trying to breathe quietly, trying not to cough, trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. The next morning established the routine that would govern the following 3 weeks. Marie woke at 6:30 as always. She made ersatz coffee and divided her breakfast ration between 2 portions. She brought Fletcher bread and jam with a pale coffee that tasted like burned wood. She left for work at 7:40. Fletcher remained in the spare room until she returned at 5:30. The deception required constant attention. Marie could not alter her routine in any way that might draw notice. She shopped for food at the same market on the same days. She greeted neighbors with the same polite distance. She attended the same mass on Sunday mornings. Nothing could change. Nothing could suggest she was anything other than what she had always been, a quiet widow surviving the occupation through cautious anonymity. But everything had changed. Every sound in the hallway made her heart race. Every knock on a neighbor's door made her imagine it was her door. Every German patrol on the street made her calculate the distance to the cellar. She was living two lives simultaneously, the visible life of Marie Dubois the ration office clerk, and the hidden life of Marie Dubois the resistance operative harboring an enemy of the Reich. Fletcher adapted to his invisible existence with disciplined patience. He remained in the spare room for 17 hours each day. He read the books Marie provided, old novels in French he could barely understand. He exercised silently, push-ups and stretches to prevent his muscles from atrophying. He wrote letters to his mother in England that he would never be able to send. He listened to the sounds of the building, learning to distinguish between normal footsteps and threatening ones. In the evenings, after Marie returned from work, they would sit together in the small kitchen and speak in whispers. Fletcher told her about England, about his family, about the bombing missions that had seemed so clear and justified from 18,000 feet but now felt abstract and distant. Marie told him about Paris before the war, about her husband, about the slow transformation of the city from a place of light and culture to a place of shadows and silence. These conversations became the unexpected heart of their strange cohabitation. Two people who should never have met, who came from different worlds and spoke different languages, finding connection in the forced intimacy of hiding. Fletcher began to see Marie not as a heroic resistance figure but as a frightened woman performing daily acts of courage that went unrecognized and uncelebrated. Marie began to see Fletcher not as a British warrior but as a boy far from home who wanted nothing more than to survive long enough to see his mother again. The danger was constant but mostly invisible. German patrols passed through the neighborhood twice daily. Gestapo agents conducted random building searches. Collaborators watched for suspicious behavior. Any of Marie's neighbors could report her for extra ration cards, for lights burning late at night, for conversations overheard through thin walls. Every day without discovery felt like a small miracle. Every night without arrest felt like temporary reprieve. On the 8th day, Madame Chevalier from the ground floor asked Marie why she had been buying larger quantities of bread. Marie explained she was baking for an elderly aunt in the countryside, a lie she had prepared in advance. Madame Chevalier accepted this explanation with a smile that suggested she accepted nothing. Marie understood she was being watched. On the 12th day, German soldiers conducted a building search looking for black market goods. Marie heard them on the stairs. She sent Fletcher to the cellar through a hidden panel in the kitchen floor. The soldiers knocked on her door. She answered with appropriate concern and cooperation. They searched the apartment quickly and efficiently. They found nothing suspicious because there was nothing suspicious to find. Fletcher had taken his few possessions with him to the cellar. The spare room looked like what it was supposed to be, a storage space for a widow's memories. After the soldiers left, Marie retrieved Fletcher from the cellar. His hands were shaking. So were hers. They sat in the kitchen without speaking for nearly an hour, both understanding how close they had come to discovery, both understanding they would have to continue pretending nothing had happened. The resistance contact who had arranged Fletcher's placement visited twice during these 3 weeks, always at different times, always with different cover stories. The first visit brought news that the escape route was being rebuilt but needed time. The second visit brought the information Marie had been dreading. The arrangements had fallen through. Fletcher would need to stay longer. Perhaps another month. Perhaps more. Marie did not hesitate. He can stay as long as necessary. The words came automatically, though she knew each additional day multiplied the risk of discovery. Each additional day meant more lies to maintain, more careful calculations, more opportunities for fatal mistakes. But the alternative was unconscionable. To send Fletcher away would be to condemn him to capture, torture, execution. She had already crossed the line. There was no going back. That night, sitting in the kitchen after Marie's decision, Fletcher tried to express gratitude that exceeded his ability to articulate. You are risking your life for me. Every day. I don't know how to thank you. I don't know how to repay this. Marie shook her head. You do not repay it. You survive. You go home. You tell your mother you met a French teacher who gave you a place to hide. That is enough. But it was not enough and they both knew it. The debt being created was unpayable because it was not transactional. It was moral. It was human. It was the kind of debt that could only be honored by living differently, by remembering what people were capable of when they chose courage over safety. 3 weeks became 6 weeks. 6 weeks became 2 months. Winter arrived with cold that penetrated the unheated apartment and made both Marie and Fletcher shiver beneath insufficient blankets. The war continued its relentless machinery beyond the walls. Allied bombers flew overhead at night, engines droning, sometimes met by anti-aircraft fire that lit the darkness with flashes like distant lightning. The routine that had seemed temporary became permanent. Fletcher mastered the art of silent existence. He learned which floorboards creaked, which walls transmitted sound to neighboring apartments, which hours carried the most danger of discovery. He memorized the building's rhythm. Madame Chevalier's German visitors arrived every Tuesday and Friday evening. Monsieur Laurent's radio broadcasts occurred nightly at 8. The mailman came at 10. The coal delivery arrived Wednesday mornings. The Gestapo patrols passed through Thursday afternoons. Marie's double life required increasingly sophisticated deception. She could not buy enough food without raising suspicion, so she supplemented rations through the black market, using connections developed through her work at the ration office. She could not explain increased use of water and electricity, so she and Fletcher both used less, bathing infrequently, keeping lights off whenever possible, burning no more fuel than a single woman living alone would burn. The psychological strain manifested in small ways. Marie's hands developed a tremor she could not control. Fletcher began having nightmares that woke him gasping, terrified his cries would alert the neighbors. Both lost weight. Both developed the hollow-eyed appearance of people living under constant stress. But they maintained the performance. Marie remained the quiet widow. Fletcher remained invisible. In December, the resistance made a new attempt at evacuation. A guide would meet Fletcher at a café near Gare d'Austerlitz. From there, they would travel by train to Lyon, then across the demarcation line into the unoccupied zone, then eventually to Spain. The plan seemed solid. Marie helped Fletcher memorize the details. On December 18th he prepared to leave. That morning felt strange and hollow. For 2 months, Fletcher's presence had defined Marie's existence. Every decision, every action, every thought had been shaped by the necessity of keeping him hidden and alive. Now he was leaving and the apartment would return to its former emptiness. They did not discuss this. They focused on practicalities. Fletcher needed to remember the name of the café, the time of the meeting, the recognition signals. At 8:45, Fletcher prepared to leave through the back entrance. Marie checked the hallway. Empty. She gave him the forged papers one final time. He thanked her in his terrible French, then switched to English. I will never forget this. Never. When the war ends I will find you. I will thank you properly. Marie smiled for the first time in weeks. Survive first. Thank me later. Fletcher left. Marie closed the door and stood in the silent apartment feeling the absence like a physical weight. She waited 3 hours before leaving for work, giving Fletcher time to get clear of the neighborhood. He returned at 3:30 that afternoon. Marie heard the knock and knew immediately something had gone wrong. She opened the door to find him breathless and terrified. The café had been surrounded by Gestapo agents. The guide had been arrested. Fletcher had seen the raid from across the street and had run, abandoning the escape attempt, returning to the only safe place he knew. Marie pulled him inside and locked the door. Her hands were shaking worse than before. This was the nightmare scenario. An aborted escape attempt meant the Gestapo knew someone had tried to meet a British airman. They would be searching for him. They would be questioning suspects. They would intensify surveillance. The danger had multiplied exponentially. That night, the resistance contact arrived with grim news. The network had been compromised at multiple levels. 3 guides were arrested. 2 safe houses were raided. The Gestapo was conducting intensive interrogations. Everyone involved needed to go to ground and wait for the heat to decrease. There would be no new escape attempts for at least 2 months, possibly longer. Fletcher would have to stay hidden through winter. Marie's apartment was now the only refuge he had. She accepted this reality without complaint, though she understood the odds of discovery increased with every passing day. 2 months of successful deception did not guarantee another 2 months. Eventually, someone would notice something. Eventually, the careful performance would crack. Eventually, luck would run out. Christmas came and went. Marie obtained a small chicken through black market connections and cooked Christmas dinner for 2 people in an apartment where only one person was supposed to live. They ate in silence, both aware of the absurdity and danger of the celebration. Outside, German soldiers sang carols in the street. Inside, a French teacher and a British pilot shared food that could condemn both of them to execution. January 1944 brought weather cold enough to see breath indoors. The apartment's heating system had been disconnected for lack of coal. Marie and Fletcher wore every piece of clothing they owned and still shivered through the nights. They slept in shifts, sharing the only heavy blanket, one person sleeping while the other kept watch, though what they were watching for and what they would do if danger came neither could quite articulate. The isolation began affecting both of them in ways neither had anticipated. Fletcher developed a paranoia that made him suspect every sound, every footstep, every voice in the hallway. He would freeze at the slightest noise, eyes wide, barely breathing, waiting for boots on the stairs. Marie developed an opposite response, a dangerous numbness born of sustained fear that made her careless in small ways. She forgot to vary her shopping patterns. She stayed up too late with lights visible from the street. She let exhaustion override caution. In late January, Madame Chevalier knocked on Marie's door one evening and asked directly, "You are hiding someone. I hear 2 people moving at night. Tell me who it is." Marie's mind went blank. Every prepared lie evaporated. She stood speechless while Madame Chevalier waited for an answer. Finally, Marie said the only thing she could think to say. "My cousin from Lyon." She needed a place to stay. Just temporarily. Madame Chevalier looked at her with an expression that conveyed complete disbelief and calculating assessment. "Your cousin should register with the authorities. It is required." Marie nodded. "Yes, of course. I will take her tomorrow." Madame Chevalier returned to her apartment without another word. Marie knew she had just received a warning. Register the phantom cousin or face denunciation. That night, Marie and Fletcher discussed options. He could leave. He could try to disappear into Paris's underground. He could attempt another escape route. But each option seemed more dangerous than staying hidden. The city was under lockdown. Random identity checks occurred constantly. The Gestapo had intensified their search for Allied airmen. Moving now would almost certainly lead to capture. Marie made the decision. He would stay. She would create forged documents for the fictional cousin. She would register the cousin with the authorities, gambling that the bureaucracy was inefficient enough that a fake registration would not be immediately detected. It was desperate and dangerous, but no option remained that was not desperate and dangerous. She used connections at the ration office to create the paperwork. A cousin named Marie Dubois from Lyon, age 36, registered at 47 Rue Saint-Jacques. The documents were reasonably convincing. She filed them with the local police station, holding her breath while the officer stamped them without careful examination. The registration was official. The fictional Marguerite existed on paper. But Madame Chevalier knew Marie had no cousin. The other neighbors would soon wonder who this cousin was and why she never appeared in public. The deception was becoming unsustainable. Each new layer of lies required additional lies to support them. The structure was becoming too complex, too fragile. It would collapse eventually. The only question was when. February brought more Allied bombing raids. The explosions were getting closer. Sometimes the building shook. Sometimes windows cracked from the pressure waves. Fletcher listened to the bombers overhead with complex emotions. These were his countrymen trying to end the war. These were also machines that could kill him and Marie just as easily as they killed Germans. The irony was not lost on either of them. On February 14th, Gestapo agents raided the building again. This time they were looking for Monsieur Laurent and his illegal radio. They arrested him on the third floor and searched every apartment in the building. When they knocked on Marie's door, she answered with the same cooperative demeanor she had shown before. Fletcher was already in the cellar. The spare room looked empty and undisturbed. The agents asked about Marie Dubois. Where was she? Why was she not present? Marie explained her cousin had returned to Lyon. The agents accepted this without challenge and moved to the next apartment. But Marie understood the net was tightening. The Gestapo now had record of Marguerite's existence and disappearance. If they investigated further, the deception would unravel. That night, Marie told Fletcher what she had been thinking for weeks. This cannot continue much longer. One of us will make a mistake. One of the neighbors will report us. One random search will find you. We are living on borrowed time. Fletcher knew she was right. But neither of them knew what to do about it. The escape networks remained compromised. The Gestapo remained vigilant. Winter made movement difficult. They were trapped in a situation with no good options, only less terrible ones. March arrived with the first signs of spring. Birds returned to the courtyard. Light stayed longer in the evenings. The weather warmed enough that the bone-deep cold of winter began to recede. And the resistance sent word that new arrangements were being made. A different route. A different guide. One final attempt to get Fletcher to safety. The new escape plan was both simple and terrifyingly complex. Fletcher would travel by bicycle to a farm 30 kilometers south of Paris. A resistance cell operated the farm as a way station for Allied airmen. From there he would join a group moving south to the Pyrenees. The timing was critical. He needed to leave on March 28, 1944, when German patrols would be focused on an expected Allied raid in a different sector. Marie helped him prepare with methodical care. They obtained civilian clothes that did not look too new or too worn. They prepared forged documents identifying him as a traveling salesman. They memorized the route, the recognition signals, the emergency protocols. Fletcher practiced his cover story until he could recite it without hesitation. If stopped, he was Jean-Pierre Fontaine, selling agricultural supplies, visiting farms in the region. The night before his departure, neither of them could sleep. They sat in the kitchen drinking ersatz coffee that had long since ceased to provide any illusion of comfort. The conversation that night ranged across everything and nothing. Fletcher talked about his childhood in Somerset, about cricket matches and summers by the sea. Marie talked about teaching Latin to disinterested schoolchildren, about her husband's terrible singing voice, about Paris in peacetime when the streets were full of light and music. They were saying goodbye to each other in the only way they could manage, by sharing the ordinary details of lives that had been interrupted by war. Fletcher understood that Marie had saved his life not once but dozens of times through months of careful deception. Marie understood that Fletcher represented something she had almost forgotten existed, proof that people could still choose goodness when the entire world was choosing brutality. At dawn on March 28, Fletcher prepared to leave. Marie gave him food wrapped in wax paper, enough for 2 days. She gave him the forged papers one final time. She checked the hallway, confirmed it was empty, and opened the door. Fletcher paused in the doorway, trying to find words adequate to 5 months of concealment, 5 months of shared danger, 5 months of unlikely friendship forged in the shadow of occupation. Thank you is insufficient. What you have done. What you have risked. I don't have words. Marie touched his arm briefly. Then do not use words. Just survive. Go home. Live your life. That is how you repay this. Fletcher left through the back entrance at 5:47. Marie watched from the window as he rode the borrowed bicycle down Rue Saint-Jacques, turned left onto Boulevard Saint-Michel, and disappeared into the early morning traffic. She stood at the window for several minutes after he vanished, feeling the apartment's emptiness settle around her like a weight she had temporarily forgotten. She went to work as normal. The routine had been her protection for 5 months and she maintained it now. At the ration office, she processed applications with the same efficiency she had shown every day. Madame Laurent noticed nothing different. The German supervisor conducted his rounds without incident. Marie returned to her apartment at 17:30, following the schedule that had kept her alive. But that evening the apartment felt wrong. After 5 months of constant vigilance, constant presence, constant awareness of another person breathing in the next room, the silence was oppressive. Marie had grown accustomed to Fletcher's small sounds. The creak of the spare room floor. The rustle of turning pages. The occasional cough quickly suppressed. Now there was nothing. Just emptiness and the distant sounds of neighbors going about their ordinary lives. She could not eat. She sat in the kitchen trying to swallow bread that felt like sand in her mouth. She kept imagining the journey. Fletcher on the bicycle, riding through the countryside. German patrols at checkpoints. Identity verification. Discovery. Arrest. She had no way of knowing whether he had made it safely. No way of knowing if her 5 months of concealment would end in his survival or his execution. At 22:15 someone knocked on her door. 3 rapid knocks. Marie's heart stopped. That was not the resistance signal. That was not Fletcher's knock. She approached the door slowly, dread filling her chest. She opened it to find Madame Chevalier standing in the hallway with an expression Marie could not quite read. Your cousin left this morning. I saw him from my window. Riding a bicycle. Your cousin Marguerite. Who is actually a man. Marie felt the world contract to a single point of certainty. This was the moment she had feared for 5 months. This was discovery. This was the end. She could deny it, but Madame Chevalier clearly knew. She could try to explain, but there was no explanation that would matter. She stood silent, waiting for Madame Chevalier to continue. I will not report you. I want you to understand that. I collaborated because it seemed the safest option. Because I have children to protect. Because I thought survival required cooperation. But watching you these months, watching your fear and your courage, I realized I have been choosing wrong. I will not report you. Marie felt tears she had not allowed herself to cry for 5 months begin to fall. She could not speak. Madame Chevalier continued. The Gestapo may still discover what you did. The neighbors may still report you. But it will not come from me. Your secret is safe. Go inside. Lock your door. Live your life as though nothing happened. That is the best advice I can give you. Madame Chevalier turned and walked back down the stairs. Marie closed her door and locked it. She stood in the hallway of her empty apartment and cried for the first time since her husband died at Dunkirk. She cried for the fear she had carried for 5 months. She cried for Fletcher, hoping he would survive. She cried for Madame Chevalier, who had chosen courage at the last moment. She cried for all of them, trapped in a war that forced impossible choices on ordinary people. 3 days later, the resistance contact arrived with news. Fletcher had reached the farm safely. He was with a group preparing to cross the Pyrenees. The escape was proceeding as planned. Marie absorbed this information with overwhelming relief. He had survived the journey. Her 5 months of concealment had not been for nothing. But the fear did not disappear. Even with Fletcher gone, even with the immediate danger removed, Marie understood she would carry this secret for the rest of her life. The Gestapo could still discover what she had done. Neighbors could still report suspicious activity. The forged documents could still be traced back to her. She had survived the hiding, but she had not yet survived the war. April brought more bombing raids. Allied forces were preparing for something significant. The raids increased in frequency and intensity. German patrols became more aggressive. Checkpoints multiplied throughout Paris. The city felt like a trap preparing to spring shut. Marie went to work, came home, maintained her routine with the discipline of someone who understood that any deviation could prove fatal. On April 23, she received her second visit from the resistance contact. This visit was different. The contact's expression was grim. We need your help again. Another airman. American this time. The networks are compromised worse than we thought. We have nowhere else safe. The contact waited for her response. Marie felt something inside her crack. She had survived 5 months by luck and careful deception. She had gotten Fletcher to safety by a miracle. The odds of surviving another concealment were terrible. Every additional day increased the chance of discovery. Every additional risk brought her closer to arrest, torture, execution. The rational answer was no. Absolutely not. Never again. But she heard herself say yes. When can he arrive? The American pilot's name was Lieutenant Robert Morrison, 21 years old, from Omaha, Nebraska. Shot down over Normandy on May 3 during a reconnaissance mission. His P-51 Mustang had taken engine damage from ground fire. He bailed out at 3,000 feet and parachuted into a forest 10 miles from Cannes. A farmer found him tangled in his parachute harness, helped him hide, contacted the resistance. Morrison arrived at Marie's apartment on May 8, 1944. Unlike Fletcher, who had been frightened but compliant, Morrison was angry and impatient. He did not want to hide. He wanted to fight. He wanted to rejoin his unit. He wanted to get back in the air and kill Germans. Hiding in a small apartment felt like cowardice to him, though Marie tried to explain that survival was its own form of resistance. The dynamic was completely different from her months with Fletcher. Fletcher had understood immediately that his survival depended on absolute obedience to Marie's rules. Morrison questioned everything. Why couldn't he go out at night? Why couldn't he exercise more vigorously? Why couldn't he speak in normal tones? Each question revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of occupied Paris, of the constant surveillance, of the neighbors who listened through walls. Marie tried to establish the same routine she had maintained with Fletcher. Morrison would stay in the spare room during the day. She would bring food morning and evening. He would remain silent and invisible. But Morrison had difficulty accepting these restrictions. On his third day, he paced the spare room so loudly that Madame Chevalier knocked on Marie's door that evening to ask if something was wrong. Marie explained she was rearranging furniture. Madame Chevalier accepted this excuse, but her expression suggested she knew Marie was lying again. After Madame Chevalier left, Marie confronted Morrison with quiet fury. You will get us both killed. This is not a game. This is not about being a hero. This is about surviving until you can escape. Do you understand? Morrison apologized, but Marie could see he did not truly comprehend the danger. He was accustomed to danger that came from flak and fighters, danger he could see and respond to. He did not understand the danger of occupied Paris, where a single careless noise, a single glimpse through a window, a single suspicious neighbor could result in Gestapo interrogation and execution. The situation became more complicated in late May when the resistance contact informed Marie that Morrison's escape would take longer than expected. Allied invasion was clearly coming soon. The Germans knew it. They had intensified security across France. Every train station was monitored. Every road had checkpoints. Moving an American pilot through this security would require careful planning and perfect timing. It might take 2 months, possibly 3. Marie absorbed this information with a sinking feeling. 3 months with Morrison's barely controlled energy and impatience. 3 months of increased risk. 3 months of maintaining a deception that had already lasted 6 months with Fletcher. The psychological burden felt crushing, but she had already committed. Turning back now would condemn Morrison to capture. June arrived with growing tension throughout Paris. Everyone knew the invasion was coming. German soldiers fortified positions throughout the city. French collaborators became more aggressive, trying to prove their loyalty before the regime collapsed. Resistance cells accelerated their operations, preparing for the moment when Allied forces would arrive and the uprising would begin. On June 6, Marie woke to the news that Allied forces had landed in Normandy. The invasion had begun. The long-awaited liberation was finally starting. But for Marie and Morrison, the invasion meant increased danger, not decreased danger. The Germans were desperate and paranoid. Security measures intensified dramatically. Random searches became constant. Anyone suspected of supporting the Allies faced immediate arrest. Morrison wanted to help the resistance prepare for the uprising. He wanted to fight. He wanted to participate in liberation. Marie had to physically restrain him from leaving the apartment. You are one American pilot. Your death will not help the invasion. Your survival will. Stay hidden. Wait for extraction. Do not throw away your life for symbolic gestures. They argued for hours. Morrison accused her of cowardice. Marie accused him of stupidity. The argument ended with both of them exhausted and neither convinced. But Morrison stayed in the apartment because he had nowhere else to go and because somewhere beneath his anger and impatience, he understood Marie was right. The weeks following the invasion were the most dangerous period Marie had experienced throughout the entire occupation. German authorities knew the resistance would activate. They conducted massive raids, arrested thousands of suspected resistance members, executed people on flimsy evidence or no evidence at all. The violence was random and overwhelming. On June 18, Gestapo agents raided the building again. This time they were looking for weapons and resistance materials. They searched every apartment methodically. When they reached Marie's door, she experienced the same terror she had felt during previous raids, but this time Morrison was in the cellar and she was more practiced at deception. The agents searched the apartment with brutal efficiency. They emptied drawers, overturned furniture, examined every closet. They found nothing suspicious. But one agent paused at the spare room, looking at the empty space with an expression that suggested he sensed something wrong. He stared at the room for nearly a minute while Marie held her breath. Finally he moved on. The agents left. After they departed, Marie retrieved Morrison from the cellar. His face was white. He had heard everything. For the first time since arriving, he seemed to truly understand the danger Marie was accepting every day to keep him hidden. That night he apologized for his earlier behavior. I did not understand. I thought I understood war because I flew combat missions. But this is different. This is a different kind of courage. I'm sorry I doubted you. Marie accepted his apology without comment. She was too exhausted for conversation. The constant fear had worn her down to something barely functional. She was losing weight again. Her hands trembled constantly. She could not sleep more than 3 hours without nightmares. The doctor at the ration office commented on her appearance. Madame Dubois, you look unwell. Perhaps you should rest. But there was no rest available. July brought more bombing raids as Allied forces fought through Normandy. German resistance was fierce. Liberation was coming, but it was coming slowly. Morrison would need to remain hidden for weeks, possibly months more. The resistance contact visited on July 20th with grim news. The escape networks were completely disrupted. All attempts at evacuation had been suspended until the military situation stabilized. Morrison was stuck in Paris indefinitely. Marie received this information with numb resignation. She had stopped calculating odds or considering alternatives. She was simply surviving day by day, maintaining the performance, keeping Morrison hidden, waiting for the war to decide their fate. She had become a different person from the quiet widow who had stamped forged papers in October 1943. The transformation had occurred so gradually she had not noticed it happening, but it was complete nonetheless. August began with news that Allied forces had broken out of Normandy. German lines were collapsing. Paris would be liberated soon. The question was whether Marie could keep Morrison hidden until liberation arrived. Every day brought new risks. Food shortages were severe. Electricity was unreliable. Water service was intermittent. The infrastructure of occupation was breaking down, which made deception simultaneously easier and harder. On August 10th, Madame Chevalier knocked on Marie's door again. This time her message was direct. The Gestapo is conducting final sweeps. They know they are losing Paris. They are trying to eliminate as much resistance as possible before withdrawing. You and your American need to be extremely careful these next weeks. They are desperate and dangerous. Marie thanked her for the warning. The alliance between them had evolved from Madame Chevalier's single act of silence into an unspoken partnership. Madame Chevalier was not actively helping, but she was providing warnings and deflecting suspicions. In the moral complexity of occupation, this represented a form of resistance, however modest. On August 19th, the Paris uprising began. Resistance fighters emerged from hiding and began attacking German positions. Barricades appeared in the streets. Gunfire echoed throughout the city. The Germans fought back with tanks and artillery. The city became a battlefield. Marie and Morrison huddled in the apartment listening to the chaos outside, both understanding that liberation was close but might not arrive in time to save them. The fighting reached Rue Saint-Jacques on August 21st. German troops set up a defensive position in the building across the street. Resistance fighters occupied the building next door. Machine gun fire echoed through the narrow street. Bullets shattered windows. Artillery shells exploded in the distance. Marie and Morrison moved to the cellar and stayed there for 2 days while the battle raged above them. They had no food beyond stale bread. No water beyond what they had stored in bottles. No information about who was winning or losing. They existed in darkness and fear, listening to the sounds of combat, wondering if the building would be hit by artillery, wondering if German soldiers would discover them during street fighting, wondering if they would survive to see liberation after surviving 10 months of hiding. On August 23rd, the fighting moved away from their street. Marie and Morrison cautiously returned to the apartment. The building had survived intact, though buildings nearby were damaged. Bodies lay in the street. Burned vehicles smoked in the intersections. The smell of cordite and death filled the air. Paris was destroying itself to achieve freedom. On August 25, 1944, Allied forces entered Paris. Free French troops led by General Leclerc arrived to find a city that had already begun liberating itself. The German garrison surrendered. Resistance fighters emerged from hiding wearing makeshift uniforms and FFI armbands. Citizens poured into the streets celebrating, weeping, singing. 4 years of occupation were ending. Marie and Morrison stood at the window watching the celebration below. Neither felt the joy that filled the streets. They were too exhausted, too traumatized by 10 months of fear. Liberation meant Morrison could leave, could rejoin his unit, could go home. Liberation meant Marie could stop pretending, could stop lying, could stop living in constant terror. But liberation also meant confronting what they had become during those 10 months. Marie had transformed from a quiet widow trying to survive into a resistance operative who had hidden 2 Allied airmen under constant threat of execution. Morrison had transformed from an impatient pilot who wanted to fight into a man who understood that survival required a different kind of courage. Morrison left the apartment on August 26 to find his unit. Before leaving, he tried to thank Marie for the 3rd time. She interrupted him. You do not need to thank me. You survived. That is what I wanted. Go find your people. Go home. Live your life. Morrison tried to argue. I will write to you after the war. I will visit. I will make sure people know what you did. Marie shook her head. No, do not write. Do not visit. Do not tell anyone what I did. This must remain secret. Even in liberation, there will be people who remember that I processed ration applications, that I had access to documents, that I could have been collaborating. If anyone discovers I hid Allied airmen, they might also discover the forged papers, the black market connections, the other small resistances. It is safer for both of us if this remains forgotten. Morrison understood. He shook her hand formally, the only physical contact they had shared in 10 months beyond accidental touches in the cramped apartment. Then he left. Marie watched from the window as he joined the crowd celebrating in the street, becoming anonymous among thousands of other stories of survival and resistance. The weeks following liberation were chaotic. Collaborators were arrested, tried, often executed. Women who had relationships with German soldiers had their heads shaved and were paraded through streets. Resistance fighters claimed credit for actions they may or may not have performed. Everyone wanted to prove they had resisted, that they had never collaborated, that they had always been on the right side. Marie returned to work at the ration office, which was being reorganized under new management. Several of her former colleagues were arrested for collaboration. Others simply disappeared. Marie was questioned twice about her activities during the occupation. Both times she explained she had processed applications, followed orders, tried to survive. No one pressed her further because there was no evidence of active collaboration. But there was also no evidence of active resistance. Marie had no one who could testify that she had hidden Allied airmen. Fletcher had returned to England. Morrison had rejoined his unit and would soon return to America. The resistance members who had arranged the hiding knew her only by a code name. She had survived the occupation and liberation with her secret intact, which meant she had survived with no recognition, no acknowledgement, no proof of what she had risked. Madame Chevalier approached her one evening in late September. We both know what you did. We both know the danger you accepted. I want you to understand that I will never speak of it. Your secret is safe. But I also want you to know that your courage changed me. Watching you hide those men while I entertained German officers. It made me understand the difference between surviving and resisting. I cannot undo my choices, but I can remember yours. Marie thanked her quietly. They never spoke of it again. The alliance forged in occupation dissolved in liberation. Madame Chevalier moved to a different arrondissement. They did not stay in contact. Some bonds could only exist under specific circumstances and could not survive their resolution. In October 1944, Marie received a letter from England. The envelope bore no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 words, I survived. Thank you. No signature. No explanation. But Marie knew it was from Fletcher. He had kept his word. He had survived. He had gone home. Her 5 months of concealment had achieved its purpose. She never received a letter from Morrison. She did not know if he survived the remaining months of the war or died in some final mission. She chose to believe he survived, but she had no way of knowing. The uncertainty became part of the legacy she carried, the knowledge that her actions had consequences she would never fully understand. The years immediately following the war were difficult for everyone in France. The country rebuilt itself physically and psychologically from devastation and occupation. Questions of collaboration and resistance became politically charged. People who had done nothing during the occupation claimed they had been secret resistors. People who had actively resisted found their contributions minimized or dismissed. The narrative of the occupation was being written, and it bore little resemblance to the complex reality Marie had lived. She returned to teaching in 1945, assigned to a school in the 10th arrondissement. The children were different from those she had taught before the war. Many had lost parents. All had experienced hunger, fear, bombardment. Teaching them required acknowledging trauma while helping them imagine a future without war. Marie found purpose in this work, but she also found it exhausting. The war had taken something from her that she could not recover. She never spoke about hiding Fletcher and Morrison. Not to colleagues. Not to friends. Not to the occasional men who expressed romantic interest. The secret became part of her identity, a hidden core of experience that separated her from people who had not made similar choices. She could sit in cafes listening to people discuss the occupation and resistance, knowing her experience was different from theirs but unable to share it. In 1948, she attended a ceremony honoring resistance members who had hidden Allied airmen. Several women received medals and public recognition for their courage. Marie sat in the audience watching, knowing her contribution had been equivalent but would never be acknowledged. She felt no resentment about this. She had chosen to keep her resistance secret during liberation. That choice meant accepting permanent obscurity. The psychological impact of 10 months of constant fear manifested in ways she had not anticipated. She developed anxiety that made routine situations feel dangerous. A knock on her door triggered panic. Unexpected visitors caused her to freeze. She would find herself calculating escape routes from her apartment even though the war was over and the Gestapo was gone. The fear had been seared so deeply that it became permanent. She also developed a strange relationship with guilt. She had survived when so many had not. She had kept 2 men hidden when thousands of other airmen had been captured and executed. She had made choices that worked out successfully when similar choices made by other people had led to disaster. Survivor's guilt became a constant companion, irrational but persistent. In 1952 she received an unexpected visit. A man knocked on her door and introduced himself as James Fletcher. He had returned to Paris on business and had tracked her down through old resistance contacts. He wanted to thank her again, to tell her he had gotten married, had 2 children, had built a good life in Somerset. He wanted her to understand that the life he was living existed because of her courage. They sat in her apartment, the same apartment where he had hidden 8 years earlier. The spare room still existed, still held boxes and old clothes. Fletcher looked at it with an expression mixing recognition and disbelief. I spent 5 months in that room. 5 months of silence and terror. I thought about that room every day for years after the war. It was simultaneously a prison and a sanctuary. Marie made tea. They talked for 3 hours. Fletcher told her about his return to England, about his difficulty reintegrating into normal life after the war, about the nightmares that still woke him occasionally. Marie told him about her return to teaching, about her own nightmares, about the weight of carrying secrets that could not be shared. Before leaving, Fletcher asked if he could tell his children about her. I want them to know that a French teacher saved their father's life. That a woman they will never meet is the reason they exist. Marie considered the request carefully, then agreed. Yes, tell them. But do not give them my address. Do not encourage them to visit. This is closure for both of us, but it is also ending. We survive together, but we cannot build lives together. Our connection exists in the past, in that specific moment of hiding in danger. It cannot extend beyond that. Fletcher understood. They shook hands formally, the same gesture Morrison had made 8 years earlier. Then he left. Marie never saw him again. But knowing he had survived, had thrived, had built a family helped her make peace with the choices she had made during the war. She never heard from Morrison. His silence remained one of the unresolved pieces of her war experience. She chose to interpret the silence as survival rather than death, though she had no evidence for this interpretation. Sometimes comfort required optimism over certainty. In 1958 she retired from teaching. She was 49 years old but felt much older. The war had aged her in ways that transcended calendar years. She moved to a smaller apartment in the 14th arrondissement, a neighborhood with no memories of occupation and hiding. She wanted to live somewhere that did not remind her constantly of those 10 months. But memories persisted regardless of location. She would see young men and wonder if they were pilots. She would hear English spoken and remember Fletcher's terrible French. She would pass ration offices and remember processing forged documents. The past could not be escaped through simple relocation. In the 1960s, as French society began seriously examining the occupation period, Marie considered writing her story. She drafted several versions of a memoir, describing her decision to hide Fletcher, the months of fear, Morrison's arrival, the chaos of liberation. But each draft felt inadequate. Words could not capture the sustained terror of waking every morning uncertain if that day would bring discovery and execution. Language could not convey the psychological transformation that occurred through 10 months of pretending normalcy while committing acts that warranted death. She ultimately destroyed the drafts. Some experiences could not be adequately communicated to people who had not lived them. The war had created a divide between those who had made life or death choices and those who had not. Marie existed on one side of that divide and most of the world existed on the other. No amount of writing could bridge that gap. Marie Dubois died on March 15, 1982, at the age of 73. She died alone in her apartment, a quiet death that went largely unnoticed. Her obituary in the local newspaper was brief. Former schoolteacher. No surviving family. Service at St. Sulpice. Few people attended the funeral. Some former colleagues. A handful of former students who remembered her kindness. No one who knew what she had done during the war because she had never told anyone except Fletcher, and he had died in 1976 without ever returning to France. Her apartment was cleared by the building management. Among her possessions they found a small box containing 2 items. A letter with 3 words, "I survived. Thank you." And a photograph of a young man in a British Royal Air Force uniform, the back inscribed, "To Marie who gave me silence when I needed it most. With eternal gratitude, James Fletcher, 1952." The building manager did not understand the significance of these items. They were placed in storage with other unclaimed possessions. Eventually they were disposed of. The physical evidence of Marie's resistance disappeared, leaving no trace of what she had risked and accomplished. But absence of evidence is not absence of impact. James Fletcher had lived until 1976 because Marie Dubois hid him in 1943. His 2 children existed because she had provided sanctuary. His 4 grandchildren existed for the same reason. One of those grandchildren became a teacher, influenced by the story her father had told her about a French teacher who had saved his father's life. That teacher taught hundreds of students over a 40-year career, some of whom became teachers themselves, extending the ripple effect of Marie's choice across generations she never met. Robert Morrison returned to America after the war. He married, had 3 children, worked as a commercial pilot. He never spoke publicly about his time hiding in Paris. His family knew only that a French woman had helped him during the war. After his death in 1991, his daughter found a letter he had written but never sent, addressed to Marie Dubois. The letter expressed gratitude for 10 months of concealment and acknowledged that his survival, his career, his family, his entire post-war existence derived from her courage. The daughter tried to locate Marie Dubois to deliver the letter. She discovered Marie had died 9 years earlier. The letter was never delivered. But the search process led the daughter to research the networks that had hidden Allied airmen during the occupation. She became an amateur historian of this specific form of resistance, eventually writing a book about the women who had provided sanctuary to downed pilots. The book did not mention Marie Dubois by name because the daughter never confirmed her identity. But it honored the kind of courage Marie had demonstrated. In 1997, the French government established a program to belatedly recognize resistance members whose contributions had gone unacknowledged. Researchers combed through records, interviewed survivors, attempted to document cases where people had resisted without receiving official recognition. They found fragmentary evidence of a woman named Marie Dubois who had processed forged documents at a ration office and may have hidden Allied airmen. The evidence was insufficient for official recognition, but it was enough to include her name in an archival database. That database became a resource for historians studying the occupation. Marie's name appeared in footnotes and appendices, usually with qualifiers like possibly and likely because definitive proof did not exist. But her story began to emerge from the silence she had chosen, reconstructed through scattered pieces of evidence and educated inference. In 2008, a historian researching escape networks discovered records of 2 Allied airmen who had hidden at an address on Rue Saint-Jacques in 1943 and 1944. The records did not name the person who had provided shelter, but cross-referencing with resistance archives and building records led to Marie Dubois. The historian published an article documenting the finding. The article was read by perhaps 200 people, most of them academics specializing in occupation history. One of those readers was the granddaughter of James Fletcher. She read the article and recognized details from the story her grandfather had told her. She contacted the historian and provided the photograph Fletcher had inscribed to Marie. The photograph became evidence. The historian published a follow-up article specifically about Marie Dubois, finally documenting her resistance with concrete proof. The article reached Morrison's daughter, who confirmed that her father had also hidden at the same address during the same period. 2 independent confirmations from the descendants of the men Marie had hidden. The evidence was now irrefutable. Marie Dubois had concealed 2 Allied airmen for a combined total of 10 months during the occupation, risking execution every day to protect strangers. In 2011, Marie Dubois was posthumously recognized as righteous among the nations, an honor awarded to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. The recognition was somewhat misapplied since Marie had hidden Allied airmen, not Jewish refugees, but the award acknowledged moral courage under occupation regardless of the specific form it took. The ceremony occurred at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Marie's distant cousin, a woman she had never met, accepted the award on her behalf. James Fletcher's granddaughter attended. Robert Morrison's daughter attended. They met for the first time at the ceremony, connected by the woman who had saved their fathers decades earlier. They exchanged stories, compared family histories, recognized how many lives had been shaped by Marie's choice to hide 2 frightened men. The recognition came 29 years after Marie's death. She never knew her resistance would be acknowledged. She died believing her contribution would remain forever obscure, one unnamed woman among millions who had made similar choices during the war. The posthumous recognition could not change her experience of silence and unacknowledged sacrifice. But it meant her story would survive her, would be taught to future generations as an example of ordinary people choosing extraordinary courage. The real legacy, though, was not the formal recognition. The real legacy was James Fletcher's children and grandchildren. Robert Morrison's children and grandchildren. The students Marie taught after the war who carried lessons of resilience and moral clarity into their own lives. The building manager who found her photograph and wondered about the story behind it. The historian who spent years piecing together evidence of her resistance. All of these people were shaped, however indirectly, by Marie's choice to open her door to a British pilot on October 21, 1943. Today, a plaque marks the building at 47 Rue Saint-Jacques. The plaque is small and easy to miss among the many other plaques commemorating resistance activities throughout Paris. It reads, "In this building Marie Dubois hid Allied airmen during the occupation, 1943 to 1944. She risked her life so others could live. Tourists walk past it without noticing. Residents of the building see it daily and no longer consciously register its presence. But the plaque exists, a physical acknowledgement of moral courage that was performed in secrecy and silence. The paradox of Marie's story is that her greatest act of courage required invisibility. She succeeded precisely because she remained unseen, because she maintained the performance of ordinary normalcy, because she hid in plain sight while hiding others. The visibility that would have validated her during the war would also have destroyed her. Only in invisibility could she achieve the impact that eventually became visible decades after her death. She never sought recognition. She never claimed heroism. She never demanded acknowledgement for risks taken and fear endured. She simply did what she believed was necessary when confronted with impossible choices. She hid two men who needed hiding. She maintained silence when silence was survival. She chose decency when choosing decency meant accepting the constant possibility of death. That is not the kind of heroism that inspires monuments or national celebrations. It is the quiet heroism of ordinary people who discover themselves capable of extraordinary courage when circumstances demand it. It is the heroism of daily choices made in fear and maintained through discipline. It is the heroism that goes unrecognized most of the time because it operates in shadows and succeeds through invisibility. Marie Dubois was one of thousands of people who made similar choices during the occupation. Most of them died without recognition. Most of their stories disappeared with them. The fact that Marie's story eventually emerged from silence was partly luck, partly the dedication of descendants who refused to let it be forgotten, partly the work of historians who believed every story of resistance deserved documentation. But whether recognized or not, the choice was the same. The courage was the same. The risk was the same. The impact was the same. Marie Dubois changed history by hiding two men in a small apartment on Rue Saint-Jacques. She saved lives that created other lives. She demonstrated that ordinary people could resist extraordinary evil through simple acts of sheltering and silence. That is her legacy. Not the formal recognition that came too late. Not the plaques and awards and historical articles. But the children and grandchildren who exist because she opened her door. The lives that were lived because she chose courage over safety. The proof that even in the darkest moments of history, even under occupation and terror and constant threat of death, humanity could persist through small acts of determined goodness. She lived quietly. She resisted quietly. She died quietly. But the silence she maintained to protect others eventually gave way to voices that refused to let her sacrifice be forgotten. And in that transformation from silence to recognition, from obscurity to acknowledgement, lies the final paradox of her story. The woman who succeeded by remaining invisible has become visible precisely because she was willing to disappear.